Hi guys, thank you for coming. Today our lecture is on fragments, navigation, and networking. And I would say this is probably one of the harder parts of the course, just because it's not something that's super intuitive, but hopefully I will be able to break it down so you guys can use it in your apps. So homework 4 was due yesterday. I don't know how many people have submitted it. I think only one person submitted on time, but that's okay. There are two slip days.
Good. If it's hard, I'm holding office hours tomorrow, 3 to 4, in Hollister 206.
So true. Okay, so let's just jump into it. So we're gonna go over fragments. And basically what a fragment is what we can see here is that the bottom stays the same, right? So the only thing different that is like the middle screen. So that's kind of what a fragment is. A fragment is just like the middle part that you can like switch out. So instead of like a whole screen, now you have like parts of a screen that you can switch out to be to present different like information. So here we have a main list fragment, a weekly menu fragment, and then a login fragment for Eatery. And basically what Fragment allows is it allows you to reuse the UI components. So at the bottom bar, you're able to reuse this, so you don't have to keep adding that to the XML. It also adds more modularity to the app architecture, which just means that it like separates all the concerns, so you can, I guess, debug easier, and it's just easier for you to like use the code base, and then it reduces redundancy. So for the lifecycle of Fragment, I kind of mentioned it a couple of lectures ago, but like an activity has multiple steps in their life cycle, right? So a fragment has those similar steps, except the host activity's life cycle will affect the fragment's life cycle. So for example, if the host activity's life cycle goes on destroy, then your fragment will also be destroyed. But the other way is not the case. So the fragment lifecycle does not affect the host activity. So if the fragment goes on pause, that doesn't mean the host also goes on pause. It would just be that singular fragment that's on pause. So it has three main methods that you would use. On create, it's called when the fragment is just being created, and most of the initialization will occur here. So this is like initializing the UI elements and just setting everything up. And then there's on create view. So this is the system's first drawing of the UI for the fragment. And basically a view is kind of like the box that you put the fragment in. So in this case for Eatery, it would be like the red outline. So just like creating that space to put a fragment in. And then on pause is called if the user is leaving the fragment. So for example, if you want to move on to the next screen and you click like through the bottom nav bar, then the fragment that you were just on would go through on pause. Does that make sense? It's very similar to like just an activity lifecycle. Okay, and then in terms of implementation, we're gonna go into this more deeply in the demo, but I guess just for now, basically what you want to do is you want to inflate a layout and indicate the container. So what we have here is each fragment has its like own like file, so its own class, and on create view, you just want to inflate it. The only thing different than like a normal activity is that you also have to specify the container. And what the container is essentially the space where like kind of like the box where you want the fragment to go in. And then these are just like, you can also put text views in it, and everything else works like a normal activity. Just kind of like the inflate container is the only difference. And then in terms of integrating a fragment into an activity, don't add a fragment in the XML. And this is because it's really hard to use if you hard code something in, right? Especially if you have 5 fragments that are showing different things, then you don't want to put all of the design choices into that XML. It'll get really long and it's gonna be hard to read. Instead, add a fragment pragmatically through an existing view group. So view group is kind of like that box that you want, right? So in your XML, all you have to specify is a container view, and you don't have to specify like the specific fragments or screen layouts you actually want. Instead, you just specify container, and then you're able to add kind of like your like another XML for your fragments, and then add those specific XMLs in. So that's just like easier to manipulate and easier to see when you're looking through all the code. And then in terms of integrating fragments into an activity, two main things is Fragment Manager. And what this does is it just manages all the fragments inside of an activity. So for example, for Eatery, I showed like 3 different screens. So those are 3 different fragments, and the Fragment Manager would like keep track of all 3 of them. And what you can do is you can do .add, and that will just add a new fragment. So for 3, you would have to do .add 3 times. And then we also have fragment transactions. So these are actions that can be applied to a fragment, which includes like adding, removing, and replacing. So what .replace does is that, for example, in like our first initial like 3 screens, if you want to move on to the second screen, you want to replace like the first like fragment with the second fragment, right? And that's kind of what .replace does. If you do .add multiple times, then depending on how you specify it, sometimes it will just add like different like views to that one screen. So instead of having like 3 separate fragments, you're gonna have like 3 fragments all on like one screen. So you'll be able to see all of that at once. So I guess typically on how we do it is we just use .replace instead of .add. And that is under fragment transactions. Does that make sense? Okay. And then in terms of creating a new fragment, it's just like creating a new activity. You just go into new, and then it already has a fragment section, and you can create a blank fragment, just how we create like a blank activity or an empty activity. Something else to note is that sometimes you want to share data between fragments, kind of like how you want to share data between screens. So instead of our put extra and our get extra, what we have is we actually have like a request key. And it's very similar, but now instead so fragment B wants to send data to fragment A. What it does is fragment B sends the data to the fragment manager. Then the manager will send it to fragment A. And that's just, I guess, an easier way to go about it instead of having to handle the logic between all of like the different combinations of fragments. The fragment manager will just keep track of all the data. So here are just like the 3 steps. First, you want to add your dependency to build that Gradle, and this is like the fragment dependency. And then you want to create a set fragment result listener. And what this does is if the fragment manager receives like information or data for like the key that you want, then you want to have a listener to be able to do something with that data, right? So basically tell the receiving fragment that we've received the data and now you guys can use it. And then in order to send the result, you just do set fragment result. And the important thing to note is that you have like the same request key for like your sending and your receiving. And the request key doesn't necessarily have to be a string. And I think that's because it's like a type like bundle, like you can kind of do whatever you want. But typically we still use strings, just like get extra and put extra.
Yeah, so this is really similar to like using intents to swap between activities. We use this set fragment result listing to transfer information between fragments. Very similar concept.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to be jumping into navigation. For navigation, we're going to be mainly covering 2 things, and this is the bottom navigation bar. So like on our Starbucks app, we have like home, scan, order. That's like the bottom navigation bar, right? And then we also have tab layout, and tab layout is kind of at the top. So it's like the menu, the featured, previous, and favorites. And we're going to kind of go through the differences. It may look very similar, but like app creators actually have like, or they differentiate them, and it'll actually serve different functions. So basically the bottom navigation is typically used for the highest level of navigation. So this includes like going from like different screens that cover completely different topics. So for example, in our Starbucks, it's like the home, the scan, the order. All of these topics are completely different, right? And it's not like, you can't like replace one with the other, I guess. And it's typically interacted with through tapping. And then for tab layout, it's more granular, which what I mean by that is it's like covering the same thing, but it's just like splitting into different like categories. So it has like menued, featured, previous, favorites. Like those are all covering different food or drink items. So it's not exactly like completely different things, but it's just like splitting a similar thing into smaller subcategories. And this is typically, or tab layout is typically used through swiping. So you would actually be able to swipe through the fragments and it'll get to a different tab. And here it's just like an eatery example. So like our tab layout is the campus in College Town because what it displays is still like the dining halls or like the cafes. And both of them do the same thing so that we would use a tab layout. But for like menus, upcoming, and profile, those things are completely different. And that's why we use like a bottom navigation bar. Does that all make sense? Okay. And it'll come, I feel like you're going to get more used to it as like you actually implement it yourself into the different apps, but it's just like, I guess this is a higher level overview. So in order to create the bottom navigation bar and the tab layout, the first step is to actually implement this material library. And this just helps to like draw it out. And it'll like handle kind of like the different button clicks too. And then in terms of the bottom navigation bar, our first step is to add a bottom navigation view to the activity XML. And that kind of just draws out like that bottom, just gives it that space and also, yeah, essentially just gives it the space and it can turn it into like a different background color. Like if you wanted like a white bar, then it would like set that. And then next, what you want to do is you want to create a menu. So what a menu is it's just a collection of different items, right? So here we have like the home, the favorite, and the profile. And you want to add each thing as a separate item. And you can also add an icon and text. So that's what creates like one section of the bottom navigation bar.
Yeah, and notice how this is in the resources folder, so this is not going to be in the layout folder. Or creating a separate XML and then putting it not in the layout folder because it's not like specifically for one view, but we're putting it in the resources folder because it's a resource that one of our view uses to display things.
Yeah. And then what we want to do is, given the XML that we just created, we want to add that to the bottom navigation view that you created initially in the activity. And this just tells like the activity that this is the XML that you want to be in like the bottom navigation bar area. So then you'll be able to see like all of your items show. And then step 4 is after you draw out your bar, you want to add functionality to the bottom navigation bar. So what we have is we have a when, and when is kind of just it's just like an if statement, but it's like simplifying it, I guess. So then you have multiple cases. So if like your home item gets clicked, then it'll like show up. In this case, it's just different text, but in other cases, it can pull up like a different fragment. It'll like inflate a different fragment. So, but in this case, if you click like the home item, then it'll show home and then favorites and then profile. And then in terms of tab layout, it's very similar in the sense that you want to also create a tab layout view in the XML for the activity. So first you create the XML view. Then you want to add all the tabs in the activity. So instead of creating a separate XML for it, you actually want to do this straight in the activity. And you just do tab layout.add tab, and then you're able to add it like that. So in this case, you're adding a home tab and then also a profile tab. And then your step 3 is you want to add a listener to all the changes, because when the user swipes through or clicks on a new tab, you want to be able to detect that and kind of carry out the functionality that you want, right? So this also uses a when. And what it's saying is that if it clicks on like the tab in index 0, then you want to do something. If it clicks on the tab in index 1, then you also want to do something. So instead of using like direct names, you're actually using like the indices of the different tabs. And then this is on tab selected. You also have on tab unselected and on tab reselected. But these you don't really have to fill out because I guess our class doesn't really cover like reselecting a tab. Kind of how in your seek bar you didn't have to do like stop tracking. These functions you can leave empty. Okay. So now we're going to go into probably the hardest topic of this class, which is networking, we actually have a lecture and demo dedicated to it the week after spring break, but I just kind of wanted to introduce it, give it like a higher level overview, and kind of give you guys like a sense of what this even means. So the purpose of networking is to essentially retrieve data from the internet or the back end. So we don't want to store all the data on the front end because it can be really slow and then it's going to make our app like really large, right? So instead we want to have like another location store it and like organize it, which also makes the work of the front end slightly easier. What you can also do is you can also store data on the cloud, and it allows like sharing data and interacting with other users. So in a lot of games, like you'll see this happen, I guess, like Among Us, you're storing your data somewhere in order to be able to join a game. Okay, and now we're gonna be going over some general HTTP requests. And this is essentially how we're able to like get the information from the backend. So what get retrieves the information from the backend, and when you, I don't know, it essentially gets it, and then post sends data to the backend. So basically, in the backend class, there's like a Reddit assignment, but post would be like creating a new post, and then getting would be like getting all the posts under a certain topic that you want. And then putting will replace the target resource with new data. And what this can be is like, it can be like replacing a post or updating a post. And then deleting is you just delete everything. So you can delete like all the posts under a certain category. You can also delete the category. And these are just some examples. So getting, in this case, would be finding a pet by a certain ID. And then putting would be like updating an existing pet. Deleting would be deleting the pet, and then posting would be maybe with a pet ID, you want to like upload an image of that pet, then you would post that. So these are just some basic requests that we kind of use to like initially set up our app, but afterwards you don't really use it. It's more of like a backend thing. But does this all make sense? Okay, cool. And then in terms of request structure, we have a header, which just contains data about the request. This can be like a timestamp, authorization tokens, which is like when you're like logging in, etc. And then the body will contain all the content of the request. So maybe you're asking for like a person's name and then their address and phone number, then the body would contain all that information. So this server will respond accordingly. So if you send a GET request, then it will return the requested info. If you send a post request, then it will basically give you a confirmation that whatever you want to post to the backend worked successfully. So this is kind of how it looks, just a header and then a body. And next week, we're going to actually be talking about how you can parse the data that you get from the backend into like essentially like variables that you can use throughout your app. And we will be using like a Moshi adapter and then also like JSON files. And then finally, just some basics over HTTP status codes. So 404 is very common, and that's just whatever you wanted is not found. So requested URL is not found. But like if it's in the 100s, then it's actually an informational response. 200 is a successful response. 300 will redirect you. 400 is client error, so that's like not found. And basically it's like the client did something wrong, right? So like if you can't find a URL, it's probably because you typed it in incorrectly, but the URL that you're looking for exists and it's still like available. And then the 500 is server error. So what this means is that like something went wrong with like maybe the website or something went wrong with your backend. And 500 is something that we really like as front-end developers because that means that it's not our problem and it's actually the backend's problem.
200 is what we like. 200 is what we like.
200 is also what we like because that means it's successful. But if something's not working, 500 is what we want. Okay, so that basically concludes the lecture.